So let's move on to the second of our readings from Aristotle. The first reading was from a book called The Categories. This second reading is an excerpt from a larger book actually called The Metaphysics of Aristotle, and we're looking at a particular part that deals with the unmoved mover, which is Aristotle's way, and we'll see why it's Aristotle's way of characterizing God. Let's look at the beginning of the reading, and the first thing that we learn is that for Aristotle there are different kinds of substance. And God, or the unmoved mover, is, we'll find out, a particular and really unique kind of substance. He says this to begin. He says, since there were three kinds of substance, two of them physical and one unmovable, regarding the latter, we must assert that it is necessary that there should be an eternal, unmovable substance. This is what he will call God. So you see what we're doing here. We're moving from a general theory of reality, which he, in the previous reading in the categories, a way of characterizing reality itself, and therefore doing metaphysics, to this other sense of metaphysics, engaging in a particular metaphysical question, the existence of and nature of an eternal, perfect being, otherwise known as God. And he will characterize that being as a particular unique kind of substance. The other two, he says, there's two other kinds of substance, and I think what he means by that is there's one kind that's very familiar, physical substance that we can experience through our senses, things like pencils and human bodies, and those types of substances are perishable. That is, they come into being and they go out of being. They're destructible. Everything that's physical, every physical substance of this sort, is temporary and perishable. But Aristotle, and this gives us an insight into historical change in cosmology and worldviews, also thought there was another type of physical substance, that is, one that could be seen and touched, theoretically touched, I guess. And those were the heavenly bodies, the celestial bodies, the planets, the stars, and everything else that I think is out there in the sky beyond the moon. And Aristotle thought that these physical substances were special and different from the things that are on Earth, that they were physical, but they were eternal, that they didn't change. So there's one type of physical substance which is perishable and temporary, and that's us and the things around us on Earth. But then there's another type of physical substance, Aristotle thought, which was eternal and non-changeable. And the heavenly bodies display this perfection, this non-change, in the type of motion that they actually engage in, which is, again, this is also historically situated, perfect circular motion. That is, obviously the sun and the stars are revolving around the Earth in perfect circles. We know now that both of those are wrong, that the sun is not revolving around the Earth is not stationary, the Earth itself is in motion around the sun. We also know that the heavenly bodies that move do not move in perfect circles. It was Kepler and Newton in the early modern period who established that they move in elliptical orbits, which are kind of like variously shaped, squashed circles. And that's all very important for the history of science, astronomy. But that's what he means by the three different types of substance. But the one we're focusing on here is the unmovable, eternal substance, which he calls God. He continues, for substances are the first of existing things. We're familiar with that, the notion of primariness. And if they are all destructible, all things are destructible. So that if there is no indestructible substance, no imperishable, eternal, lasting forever substance, then there's nothing that could last forever. There's nothing eternal in the universe, because if substances aren't eternal, and substances are the first and primary beings, then nothing is eternal. But it is impossible that movement should either have come into being or cease to be, for it must always have existed, or the time should. Now there we're getting into Aristotle's physics and his notion of how what the laws are that govern the cosmos and the physical world. He believes that it's impossible that motion should have come into being from non-motion. That is, if something is in motion, it was put in motion by something else, according to Aristotle. So if there is motion in the world, it's because things were put into motion by previous things that were in motion. So if there was a time, let's say, or maybe a time before time, when the universe had no motion in it, then it would have been impossible for the universe ever to have motion in it, because motion is always derived from previous motions. There he's indicating that there's a necessity of something always having been in motion, an eternal motion, that can account for the fact that there is the temporary motion that we see around us. It is impossible that movement should either have come into being or cease to be, for it must always have existed, or that time should, for there could not be a before and an after if time did not exist. Movement also is continuous then, in the sense in which time is, for time is either the same thing as movement, or an attribute of movement. So if movement has to be eternal, that is, that there was always movement, then there must have always been time too. He seems to be suggesting it's conceptually impossible to conceive of a state of the world before time. Time itself, whatever it is, must have always been. And there is no continuous movement except movement in place, and this only. And of this, only that which is circular is continuous. This notion that circular motion, what Aristotle believed to be the motion of the heavenly bodies, was a kind of perfect motion and capable of being continuous, whereas linear motion, I think he thought of as eventually wearing itself out or stopping. He's beginning to discuss this unchangeable eternal substance, and gradually he's revealing that he's talking about God, and that's an interesting thing for a Greek, because officially at least they were polytheistic, that is, believed in many gods. But I think that many philosophers were always rather uncomfortable with that. That is, they tended in their thought to gravitate towards monotheism, belief in one God, because for various reasons the many-God theory can lead you to some logical difficulties. So Aristotle really is speaking in this section like a monotheist, and something that's very hospitable to Christians, Jews, and Muslims in terms of its description of God on a certain level. To continue, let me just check the time here. But if there is something which is capable of moving things or acting on them, but is not actually doing so, there will not be necessary movement. For that which has a potency need not exercise it. Now, this is very important language for Aristotle's view of reality, especially in this context. Actuality, and actually, and potentiality and potency. And what he wants to describe is, eventually, I think, how he wants to describe God is a being that is pure actuality and no potentiality. Because if God had any potentiality, God would, in a way, not do the work that Aristotle thinks is necessary in order to sustain the universe. You and I have potentials, lots and lots of potentials. We can actualize some of those potentials, but many of those potentials, in fact, I would say most of the potentials of a finite being like you and me, that most of those potentials go unfulfilled. The picture of God that he'll be painting here is one of no unfulfilled potential, of pure actuality, of always being at work, energeia in Greek. So we're getting further into this description of an argument for the existence of God and description of God in the next video.